What makes a good historical epic? Brutal, bloody battles like Kingdom of Heaven? Authentic weaponry and armors like Alexander? Or an incredible protagonist, someone to root for, who takes you through a twisting rollercoaster of a story like in Gladiator? Whichever answer you gave, I think we can all agree that these are all components that decide the fate on whether it's just a story that happens to be set in history or a historical masterpiece. And this is no different in games. Kingdom Come Deliverance, released on the 13th of February 2018, set to be the next age of medieval storytelling. So did it accomplish all these things? Did it do enough to enter the rafters of historical gaming prowess? But throughout this, there's one thing to be sure. Kingdom Come Deliverance divided a fan base. 1403 was the perfect choice and setting. The highest points of the medieval period of knights and kings, armies fighting for territory, and a tapestry of rich characters and stories to tell. Yet it's the gameplay that took many people's attention. First-person medieval games are always an interesting one, especially when combat is involved. In a modern shooter, it kind of makes sense. A first-person view to be able to look down at the sights, see an enemy, and ping off a shot into the head of an unsuspecting foe. Yet when it comes to sword fighting, it's a whole different ballgame. Games for a while have been trying to find the best way to get it right. Mount & Blade went with a primarily third-person sword fighting system. Yes, I know it has first-person, but if you play Mount & Blade in first-person, you hang around schools. Chivalry and Mordhau went with a predominantly first-person combat system, but it did it in a way where it was complete flowing combat. No lock-on, just free, full-swinging, choppy goodness, and it worked great. Some of the best combat and duels that you'll get in any games can be found in a title like Mordhau. So, would Kingdom Come go with something similar? Well, yes and kind of no. You see, whilst Kingdom Come was massively praised, criticism was definitely there. But forget the buggy launch and the terrible save system, they were universally disliked. It was the combat itself that was the one that divided the fanbase. Warhorse Studios went with the idea to use lock-on directional combat. It took a similar turn to Mount & Blade with the angles of attack, yet tried to expand upon that, giving players more directions to attack from and different special moves. Based on the accurate historical martial arts and sword fighting, KCD gave players the option to chamber, parry, counter, and dodge oncoming strikes before giving back their own. On one side, as mentioned, it added way more complexity to what Mount & Blade ever had, with its somewhat limited 4-directional combat. But in Mount & Blade, there were 4 directions for attacking and 4 directions for defending. In KCD, it was just this directional combat for offensive strikes. Blocks would be done with a timed parry on the Q key, making the players focus more on timing rather than direction. Because of its aim for historical accuracy, the game brought in other weapons to the mechanics. Maces, two-handed and one-handed weapons, all having different properties and damage vectors. Personally, I think the combat for KCD is fantastic, but only in some situations. When it comes to dueling in an arena against one opponent, it's the best balance between realism but also a difficult to master system. But once you've finally mastered it, train with a sword and increase your skill, there's a vast amount of satisfaction that comes with that power. However, Kingdom Come's combat mechanics were a massive talking point, and with many people it came with criticism. My favourite headline from a forum post that I've seen is, "The combat makes me want to kill myself." Okay, maybe going a bit overboard, but going on to state that no matter how hard they practiced, they just couldn't get along with what KCD had implemented. And I don't think the rebuttal could just be get good, because whilst there's an element of practice, saying get good isn't always an excuse for inaccessible fighting mechanics. And I think that's the important part. You see, I keep bringing up Mount & Blade because I think that game perfected that easy to understand but difficult to master fighting system. Anyone can block and parry in that game. You could even turn on an auto-blocking system if you really wanted. So it didn't really matter if you played for 10 or 100 hours. You could always still get a hand of the mechanics. Yet it was scalable. In Mount & Blade, the better you got, the more moves and techniques you could figure out to beat opponents. But Kingdom Come doesn't have that scalability. It has the difficult to master part, but not the easy to understand bit. Because the game itself lent so much into the RPG element, practicing was paramount to the combat to even get slightly good at it. Yet realistically, many people don't have hours and hours to grind into the game just to get competent at one of the core mechanics. Some people are here just to play the story and that's that. And whilst I know there are many people like me out there who are probably watching this video, we love sinking hours and hours into finding all the complexities in the fighting of KCD and are willing to put the time in to get sufficiently good. But the game forces you to do that. There's no easy option for a more casual player. And I think in this case, more choice would have been better. Yet Kingdom Come Deliverance said, "This is our combat, like it or don't play it. There was no easy introduction. There was no other way to learn it. It was either you got good at it or you just wouldn't enjoy the game. And that's why I think a lot of people took to disliking the mechanics. But after this, even me, a long-time player and someone who even had up to 40 hours in the beta before the game was even released, I even have criticism of the combat. As I mentioned, I think it's great when it comes to one-on-one fighting and duels, but any more than that, forget about it. Warhorse's decision to use lock-on combat was definitely its downfall in the bigger fights, taking on bandit groups, or even when it comes to some of the larger skirmish campaign battles that you'll come across. The game would lock you onto one opponent, whilst other enemies around you just slapped you in the back and there was little to nothing that you could do. Yeah, you can switch the enemy that you're locked onto or even run away, but it was clunky to do so and it kind of brought you out of this realistic combat feeling. In the early days of the game, you were able to confuse the game a little bit. Hold the sprint key while slashing would stop the game from locking onto the opponent, as it thought that, of course, you were sprinting, but it would still attack at the same time. So you were able to deal damage without attaching yourself to just one opponent. But as far as I'm aware, that was shortly patched out. So there you are, attacking one bandit, whilst out the corner of your eye you see another approaching. Okay, you can switch to that bandit, block their attack, but then the first will come and hit you. So either way, you're going to take damage there. A game like Mordhau that goes with the first-person style like Kingdom Come chose to not have this lock-on combat, and it gives the player the ability, if they get good enough, block multiple strikes at once, or dodge and attack a number of enemies with one hit. But KCD doesn't give players that option. When fighting multiple enemies at once, you're still limited to that lock-on combat that forces you into a one-on-one fight. For weeks after launch, there was this constant discussion. People new to the medieval genre of games complained that the fighting was terrible, old experienced players telling them to just get good, and to be fair, no real side was right in this. I kind of agree with both sides. Yeah, I like the way that Kingdom Come embraces its RPG elements, that forces you to practice and get good at skills like you would in real life. But you need to remember, it is still a game, and its Kingdom Come's insistent with ultimate realism that in some ways is its winning formula, but also a downfall in many people's eyes. So, what would my solution be? Well, if I'm going to be honest, I don't see why a combat system like Mordhau's would be any detriment to KCD's playstyle. It worked brilliantly in first person there, and the only reason I could see that it wouldn't work in another Kingdom Come game is that it's so free-flowing and slick that it's probably quite hard to code AI and NPCs to, use it well. And this theory is actually proved in Mordhau itself, as the bots in that game have no idea what they're doing and they really can't use that combat system anywhere near what a player can themselves. But please, I'd love to know what you think. I personally like the combat in Kingdom Come, but I'm not blind to the amount of criticism that came with this really unique and proprietary way of adding in first-person sword fighting. Did you like the direction of KCD, or do you think they could have done something else to improve upon it for the next title? But either way, whatever side you land on, there's one thing for sure. Kingdom Come Deliverance combat really did divide its fanbase.